So hello, everyone. Welcome to our first thematic webinar on the Efficiency for Access Design Challenge year 2023 to 2024. So today we'll be discussing research within the challenge and understanding the research landscape of the solar appliance sector, really. So as a bit of housekeeping before we begin, the session will be recorded and will be made available afterwards over email and CrowdSolve. So if you would not like to be recorded, please turn off your video and mute yourself. We will have a Q&A section for what I hope is a big chunk of the session today, but feel free to send in questions over the chat during the whole call throughout the presentations. We can pick those up at the end. And I'm joined today by Rachel, who you may have met in our last mentoring webinar, who'll be managing the chat and keeping track of all those messages. So if you need any help, just get in touch with her. And during the Q&A, feel free to raise your hand and ask your questions by coming off mute. And again, if you don't feel comfortable doing so, you can do it over the chat. So this is our agenda for today. Firstly, I'll briefly introduce the relevance of this subject to the challenge. We'll meet our speaker, Liya. I'll introduce her briefly then. You can see her on the call now. And then she'll take it away with her presentation. And then we hope to spend a big chunk of the session today on Q&A. So I hope you can with some questions. So today we're discussing the industry landscape, something I felt was really important for us to do early on for all of you. And as you may have seen when reviewing previous year's webinars, we typically highlight how each webinar can help you in the challenge by identifying a key assessment criteria that it pertains to. But when we're discussing research, it really pertains to all of them. So this is because you'll need to conduct research on every aspect of the assessment criteria and all the research questions presented there, and ensure you're well informed on each of those questions asked. So just like any work at university, everything you write and present will need to be informed and evidenced. To claim that something is going to improve the social impact of your design, you should be able to kind of provide evidence for that. So researching on the challenge. So this is particularly important because your final submissions and the pitches will be assessed by industry professionals who may be aware of the other technologies on the market and what the current innovations are. So keep them in mind as someone that's going to be looking at your submission and determining whether you're innovating on kind of an industry level. So you're also at an early stage of the development of your design. Most of your work will therefore need to be informed by research through literature review. For example, you won't be able to determine the complete environmental or social impact of your design. You won't be able to determine where it sits in the market, for example, or how the market will necessarily respond. You'll have to look at examples that already exist to best inform your own designs. This is why this session is so important for you at this early stage, because you're embarking on a long journey, and the quality of this early research will provide the foundation for your future submissions and the designs that may go much further than even the challenge. So I've seen in the past students working on a project for months, but coming to the end to realize that their reviewer has identified that their technology is using kind of an outdated innovation or way of thinking. And while this may only slightly impact the innovation section of your assessment criteria, for example, it's just that this time could have been spent further innovating on something that already existed, right? So this is your project and your design first and foremost. So it's always, I think, best if you can make it the best product it can be. And this innovation that you identify early on in your concept note and early stage of your development may inform the work that you do over the next several months. So this is an excellent opportunity to make sure that you're working with technology and thinking that can best advantage you. So as you can see, I think this is an important part of your journey, but sadly, one we've never discussed in a webinar so far. You may have seen in the library. So to fill that gap, we thankfully have Liya Bensy Thomas with us, one of our senior researchers here at Efficiency for Access and working with us at the Energy Saving Trust. Liya is a seasoned researcher with over 5 years of extensive research experience in the climate change and sustainability sector. Is a trained ethnographic researcher, Liya has adeptly contributed her expertise to various impactful research initiatives. Her current focus revolves around shaping and executing research projects within the Low Energy Inclusive Appliance Program, LEA for short. Liya holds dual master's degrees, one in international development, environment, climate change, and sustainability, and the other in natural resource governance. So I'll pass it on to Liya for the rest of today's session, and then I'll come back for the Q&A. But yeah, please welcome Liya. Let me know when you want me to change slides, Liya.
Yes, thank you, Sean. Thank you for the introduction. So as he mentioned, I'm Liya Bensy Thomas. I work on research initiatives under Efficiency for Access, and I work with Jakub Vrba. He's also on the call today, so we'll both take your Q&A. So we can begin. Next slide, please. Yes, so this presentation will give you an idea about how and where to do your research, what are the resources that you can access, and things that you should keep in mind when you're doing your research. So let's begin. So let's say you have an idea. You have an idea for an automated irrigation system or a cooling solution or a pest control technology, and you want to start your research. So how and where do you start? So like any other research, you start with reviewing the existing literature. Next slide, please. So when you're doing your research, so when you're diving into the research, what you want to know is, has this idea been done before? Is this already in the market? If so, in what context? What geography was this done? Is it successful? And how many companies are doing it? So these are all the questions that you will have. And these are all big questions. So how do you jump into the research? So the 4 questions on the slide that you see is more of a guidance in terms of how to guide that initial research. So you begin by asking, what is the challenge that you're trying to address? So once you have the challenge narrowed down, then it becomes easier to identify your target audience, the geographical context, etc. So for example, I come from India. So let's say I have an idea for an irrigation system. Now, in India, I have seen small scale farmers to practice flash flooding for irrigation, and they do not always have the resources, the water resources nearby to their farms, or they do not have direct electricity to power their generators to pump the water. So, I want to innovate something that's easily accessible, affordable to the farmers, to the small scale farmers who have meager income and can run on off grid and uses less water. So when I identify that challenge, I can help, it helps me narrow down my focus, my target audience. The other question that you want to know is, I want to know is, how has this been done before, and how many technologies are there in the market right now? So as Sean mentioned, that you might find some technology, and you can get more into what is the technology that they're using. Is it more latest? So if I'm introducing sensor to my automated irrigation system, so I want to say, oh, it's assessing based on the soil moisture. So that's one way to look at it. So, and also think about it in the sense that your concept note is ideally your sales pitch. You're trying to convince an investor to buy your idea. So you want to convince it in a way saying that you have done your due diligence, you know what is already in the market, and why your design is different from the others, and how yours is improving or better than the others. So that's the next question. Are you adding value to an already existing technology, or are you developing entirely something new? Now, sometimes people mistake that you have to develop entirely something new to make it more, big and beautiful, but you don't always have to do that. You can improve on something that's already out there. So think about Apple. Apple didn't create my computers from scratch. They looked at something that was there in the market, they identified a gap with it, and they improved on that technology. Now Apple is a big giant. So it's not always about coming out with something entirely new. And then the other way to look at it is adapting an existing technology to your context. So, for example, let's say there's something that's been done and tried in large scale farming in the US, which is not affordable for every farmer and maybe not relevant for your context where there are smaller farms. So maybe you can think about how you can adapt that technology to your context. So there are different ways you can approach the initial research. So these are just guiding questions that you can keep at the back of your mind when you're delving deep into the research. Next question, please. Next slide. So here we have given resources that you can access. This is more of a starting point. All of these websites have a pretty decent search function, so you can put in the keywords for your research and you will find latest reports, latest news and blogs on the technology that you're looking into. And from there, you can find the companies that are working on these technologies or the stakeholders, the key players, and then from there, you can take your research ahead. So consider this as a starting point. This is not an exhaustive list. It doesn't address all the questions that you might have, but just as a guidance. And not all of these websites will have information about everything, so you will have to do a bit of back and forth, but this is a good place to start. Next slide, please. So as Sean mentioned, your concept note we will assess based on 4 main criterias: the innovation, the sustainability of your design, its social impact, and the sustainability of your scalability of your design. So when it comes to innovation, next slide. We want to know how your design is improving on something that's already there in the market. So there could be similar technologies that's there, that's done and trusted. So how is yours different from that? So you have to first answer the question, are you developing something new or are you improving on an existing technology? Is yours different because your production cost is low, or is it more user friendly? Can it be repaired more easily? So what makes yours different from the others? So here again, we have given links to few resources. Consider these as a starting point. These will not answer every question that you have, but it will help you understand the existing technologies, who are the companies that are working in this sector, and what you should consider when you're thinking about production cost of your design or the repairability of your design. Next slide, please. Now, other point is around sustainability. So here we want to see what is the environmental impact of your idea. Have you thought about how your idea is contributing towards sustainable development goals? So something that we noticed in previous year's concept notes is students often claim that their design or solution is net zero because it's solar based. That is a big, big claim to make. So be very often you make that claim. So when you say something it's net zero, you're essentially saying that from raw material extraction to the manufacturing of your design, to the actual use, the transport, and the end of life of that design, it doesn't have any carbon footprint or water footprint, which is a very, very beautiful thing to say in an ideal world, but it's not always possible. So most designs will have carbon footprint. So, and that you assess that carbon footprint through life cycle assessment of that design. Now, this is not something you would have to carry out for your specific design, but this we've given few resources that you can take a look, more of an introduction into what it means when you say something is net zero. And also you have to think about how your specific design is contributing to sustainable development goals. So again, do not just mention that it contributes to SDG 6 or SDG 7. Look into the targets and specify which target specifically yours is contributing to. And I've also given a link to the technologies, 50 breakthrough technologies that are required to achieve SDGs. Now, this is not a guidance in terms of, we are not saying that these are the technologies that you should focus on, but this is just to indicate how technologies are linked to contributing sustainable development goals. So you will get an idea on how, what is the link between technologies and addressing sustainable development goals. Next slide, please. Now, social impact. Here we want to know have you thought about how your design is improving people's lives? So have you considered gender and disability in your design? Have you thought about how affordable it is going to be for different economic groups? Now we've given links to few papers which talks about inclusivity in terms of gender, disability, affordability, geography, maybe to an extent. So again, think about how you're going to convince the investor to say that you have thought about uh, how you're addressing the needs of the target end users. So have you thought about their geographical context, cultural context, their social, economic context, and how your design is suited to that? Next slide, please. And lastly, on scalability, have you thought about, is this design marketable? Do you have a market for this? So you might come up with a design and could work well for if you're developing 1 or 2 units, but if you're thinking about manufacturing 100 or thousands of it, do you have it market for it? Are there users who are going to buy it? Is it affordable for people who want to buy it? Have you thought about a business model that would work for your design? And do you think your model is commercially viable? So these are a few questions that you should keep in mind when you're looking at scalability. So think again from a sales point of view that you're trying to convince your investor to invest in your design. So you have to convince that you have thought about the market viability of your design and that your model can be scaled and what are the implications of it on the production cost. So developing one could be easier, but if you're developing 100, it could have import duties and tax implications. So things that you should keep in mind when you're looking at scalability. And I will stop here, but if you have any questions, please feel free to ask between, I think, Rachel, Sean, me, and Jakub, we will be able to address at least some of your questions. Thank you, Sean.
Right. Thank you, Liya. Thank you very much. And so you all know, we'll be sharing the slides on CrowdSolve and over email after this. So Liya's put a bunch of brilliant resources in there for all of you, like different databases to look at, and then all those actual resources as well. So you'll be able to access those at the end. But while we have kind of our expert researchers in the room, it would, what we really wanted to do was spend most of this time providing them as a resource for you for questions. So if anybody has questions over the next, we'll be sitting here for the next 40 minutes or so until those questions exhaust themselves. Please put them in the chat, raise your hand, any of the sort. So I'll be able to, Rachel and I will be able to answer anything more challenge related. Liya and Jakub will be able to answer anything research or technical related. So please send them in and keep them coming. In the meantime, I have a couple questions myself that I can fill in while people are thinking of their own. The first one was, how do you determine your findings are the most up-to-date research available?
So one thing is, so the resources that we have given in the slides should help you with latest reports and latest news on the latest technology. So that's a good place to start. The other way is when you're doing a simple Google search, if you're looking for articles, since you're in 2023, 2024, look for latest articles. So something that's published at least after 2019. So filter your research based on the publication date. And the other way is keep an eye out for webinars and events that's been done on these technology. So there you will get more latest information because written research sometimes take time so webinars is another way, but the resources that we have given in the slides is a good starting point. Most of them will have latest research.
Okay, great point about the recency of the research as well. So I think that's something that people forget, and something that is dependent on the different whatever area you're researching in. So sometimes that might be further back or more recent. Another good point connected to Liya said 2019 or later. Everything in the challenge brief is now 2019 or later as well. So if you're looking for resources on a particular area or a particular technology, remember to check the challenge brief for different resources there as well. Those will all have relevant things. Calvin, you have a question? And just before you ask it, actually, Simon Allen has said that they've joined and missed the innovation and sustainability part. Don't worry, it's all recorded, and we'll share the recording after this, so you can watch it in post. We'll also share the slides. But Calvin, go ahead, ask your question.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Liya, for the presentation. I just want to ask guys, how technical should we be in our reporting? Should we be technical, or just our reports are going to be read by laymen? I don't know, like how technical should we be? Thank you.
I think I can answer that one. So it really depends. So I'd say strike a balance. They won't necessarily be engineers reading your reports, but they may very well be. You don't need to go into too much theory. There is a word limit on your report. So I would say you need to provide evidence. So often I get reviewers that say something like, I didn't see any calculations on the environmental impact of your design. How are you calculating that? How are you determining whether they're actually having a low environmental impact or low carbon footprint? That's something I often see. So you need to provide evidence, and I think calculations are important to provide there. But if you're spending several pages just showing you're working, your reviewers often won't be able to follow all those calculations. They may be someone who works in selling appliances or has like a lot of experience in the field of appliances or has experience researching appliances, but not necessarily like kind of how you calculate different wattages and things like that. And I think especially for the pitching session, you only have 10 minutes, right? So it is really like an investor's pitch. So you want to show that you have that technical knowledge, but you don't need to present all that technical knowledge in that 10 minutes. So especially in the pitching session, you'll likely get industry professionals that are more on the business side. There will likely be one engineer on your 3-person panel. But I would say keep that one much more broad. So I think that's a good point. Show that you have all that technical knowledge and you've done that research, but you don't necessarily need to present it all, if that makes sense, Calvin.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, muted myself. I see Tavatswa asked the question in the chat. Are there any emerging areas or technologies within the engineering that you think we should consider looking at? Anything that's particularly innovative or new, I guess in general, things that are being considered across the landscape as like a new feature. I think this is you, Jakub and Liya. You would know much better. I don't know if it's more specifically within each technology or however you want to answer.
Jakub, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can give it a go. I mean, it's a great question. And to be honest, there are so many. So only under the Efficiency for Access Coalition, we have worked on 33 technologies already, and that's certainly not all of them that are out there. So there are probably, between 50 or 100 technologies that could fall within the scope. And I believe that Sean and the team shared some of the innovations that have been done in the past. And we, of course, have quite a lot of resources on the website. So I would encourage you to look at that. But yeah, happy to answer kind of if I think it's important to narrow down a little bit the focus that you would like to tackle. So for example, you might be interested in agriculture or health or humanitarian or any other areas. And then once you have that, then your scope will narrow down a little bit. And then as you do kind of this initial research, you will hopefully keep narrowing it down until you end up with specific technology that fits best the challenge that you want to address. So I would suggest going that way rather than looking at all the technologies at the moment, because that could be a little bit overwhelming. But there's, I would say, even for maybe the more mature technologies like solar water pumps, there is still so much innovation that needs to be done that you could, even for kind of technologies that have been around for a while, you can still find areas that could be improved in terms of efficiency and its design, affordability, environmental impact. So yeah, the scope is very broad.
Right. And I think there's like plenty of space to play within solar appliances for innovation because there's lots of room there. If you need further inspiration, look at previous submissions to the challenge. Those are all available online. Give you some ideas of what people have done in the past. And of course, there's a challenge brief. And under each technology area, there are some key highlights that we've pulled out, some new innovations, some new things to look at. And then at the bottom of all the technology themes area, there's even an additional technology area that kind of covers things that might fall under different categories like washing machines or other kind of horizon technologies. And then I would just say also on areas of engineering. So one thing that Engineers Without Borders is always pushing for quite a lot is globally responsible engineering. So they see this as kind of a new way of thinking within engineering. So this is captured within the assessment criteria, considering all the assessment criteria and looking at the globally responsible design sections within the challenge brief should tell you kind of emerging areas of thinking within engineering that you can then apply to your project, if that makes sense. So I think those are important to consider as well. I had another question. How can you present your research in a way that both affirms the credibility of your work, but also critically evaluates that work?
Okay, I would say that so for you to critically evaluate your work, you have to be very transparent in your methodology and your limitations. So keep mentioning that your research scope is this much. Now you might be addressing a bigger problem, but your research scope is limited. So keep acknowledge that in your writing. And also discuss the limitations, saying that you had data related limitations or you had your own personal biases or there are any other shortcomings in your methodology. So keep addressing that in the narrative so that you're critical of your own research, you acknowledge the limitations of your research. Now, to build your credibility, I would say is to compare and contrast your research findings with the existing literature. So you could be agreeing to something that's already out there, or you could be contradicting. Either way, keep referring to the larger literature and say how yours is agreeing to the literature out there, or yours is contradictory because of these reasons. So that's another way. And another way is to have your research peer reviewed by someone in the field. So um, an expert or a key stakeholder in the field. So that way you can bring credibility. So the person might not only give you feedbacks and insights about your research and help you identify the gaps in your research, but also mentioning the person's name or adding them as a reviewer in your research will help you build that credibility for the reader. And that's how I would do it. Please feel free to jump, Jakub, if you have anything to add.
On the peer reviewer, I think that Liya brought up, you can always use your mentor. So if you have your once you submit your concept note, we can start pairing you with a mentor, and they can be kind of that credible source of information for you, or be able to pull out those gaps if they're able to review your final submission. Thanks, Liya. I think that's all really important because it's a difficult balance to strike between kind of criticizing yourself and making yourself seem credible, that I think is difficult to balance in research. People, keep your questions coming over chat or raise your hand. Feel free to jump in at any time. Go ahead, Calvin.
Thank you. I'm still reading the brief note. Pardon me for taking long to read it, but I need to understand exactly what I'm going into. So there's a question I wrote down, that is there a template for our final report, or we just write according to what we think is best for us?
There is no template. It has to be 4,000 word report. But how you format that, how you lay that out, is up to you. One thing I would say is that think of your assessment framework. So when a reviewer is looking at your assignment or your submission, sorry, they will be looking at how you answer those questions presented in the assessment framework word for word. So everything that you see within that assessment framework is the same thing that your reviewers will see when they're assessing it. So make sure that you're very clearly responding to all those questions. It doesn't, I mean, there are definitely more creative ways than just laying out the question and how you're answering it, but some people do choose to present it that way. Yeah, we see all sorts of ways that people present their research and their submissions within the challenge. I do think the appearance of it's not part of the assessment, but it always gives a good impression, right? So think about how you're presenting your research and how you're laying that all out. Give it some thought when you're approaching it. Again, you can also look at all of the submissions from previous years on the website, and you can see how others have done it. And you can also cross-reference against who won awards and how they presented their research. I know that specifically, some people asked me last year, okay, who should I be looking at the final submissions? And we just said, oh, these are the winners, and you can find all of their submissions on the website here. So that's, I think, a helpful resource as well. And no worries, Calvin, about taking some time to read the brief. You still have plenty of time, and it's a huge document. So I do think it's really helpful to read through, but take your time going through it. Okay. How can a team know when they have done enough research? Like, when do you stop the research process and start writing or building? I think this is a difficult one because you can get stuck in some rabbit holes.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer as well. So what I usually do is, so I practice law of diminishing returns. So once I feel like I'm getting the same results from my research, I'm Googling and I'm typing keywords and I'm getting the same articles, same reports, and I'm not getting any new information, then I figure that that's a good point to stop. Now I established that my groundwork has been laid. It's time to move on to the next phase. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're putting a full stop to your research. You're saying that with whatever perspective or angle you were taking in at this point, you have got all that you could get out of that. Now you move on to the next phase. Once you start developing, thinking about more of your design, you might come in from a different angle. You might have more questions. You might get a different perspective. So then you again come back to the research. But when you reach a point when you feel like you're not getting any new information, then that's a good point to stop. But when you're working in a team, you have to make sure that the team members agree with it as well. So if all of you agree that, okay, we've sufficiently explored the topic and this is fine, we can move on to the next phase, that's good. And other thing to consider is assess the time that you've spent in research. So don't spend major chunk of your time on research. So keep that in mind and see if spending additional time is going to get you very significantly additional results, then it's good. But if not, then it's time to move on. That's how I would do it.
Great, thanks, Liya. I know, yeah. If you don't stop yourself, you could research forever on something. I have my lecturer at the moment is doing his PhD, and he's been researching the same topic for maybe 5 years, and he says that he sometimes finds articles that 3 years down the line or something that existed back then but now are helpful. So I think Liya's, yeah, giving you some very good advice that when those returns are diminishing, to kind of stop that process. You only have a few months for this. Tafatswa asks, as we carry out the research, what are some absolute don'ts or common pitfalls to avoid in our research to ensure its success and integrity? Liya or Jakub, which one would you like? Okay, go ahead, Liya.
Jakub, do you want to take it?
Yeah, no problem. Again, good question. I would say what we have seen in the past is, and what can sometimes annoy the reviewers a little bit, is when there are big claims made without any supporting evidence. So Liya has already flagged one when students would say that their design is 100% sustainable and 100% renewable, and there's no environmental impact because it's powered by solar energy. But there is so much more to it, like the life cycle assessment, the embedded emissions, and the other environmental impacts that are associated with developing any product out there, that it's better to be kind of critical of the design and highlighting some of these disadvantages while also focusing on the positives, right? So if it can also be that there has been no life cycle assessment done for your specific technology, and that's completely okay, but it's better to be clear about it in the submission and even state that there have been kind of no research done in this space, but you acknowledge that that's something that should be done in the future. So I think it's better to be kind of honest when you couldn't find any evidence, rather than making claims without the evidence being backed. So that would be one. Sean, you might have some other ideas. What are the absolute don'ts?
In terms of research, I think you have the key one there is don't make a claim without evidence. I agree. It's very frustrating as a reviewer or someone looking at your report, especially if you're trying to use that report for any sort of your own research. If someone is making a claim and then not backing that up with even a citation or your own working, then it it's difficult. It makes it difficult to believe everything else in the paper as well, every claim that you make. So make sure that it's all kind of systematically cited. Other don'ts, I'm not I'm not quite sure. I think don't get stuck in a rabbit hole as well. You can often try to find an answer to a question and it raises maybe 1,000 other questions. Consider what questions are important to your research and are like need to be presented. So you could end up with you could end up trying to answer infinite questions as you go through your process. Just make sure you're spending the time answering the questions that are relevant to you and relevant to your process. Liya, do you have anything to add to any of that?
I think you've both covered it well.
Okay. What I have another question. What are the merits of primary versus secondary research at this level? Do you have any tips for approaching primary research in the field as well?
That's a very good question. And as an ethnographic researcher, I'm biased towards primary research. But I wouldn't recommend one is better than the other. You have to weigh your resources and time that you would want to invest in the research. So primary research would mean that you have to go to field, collect data, whereas secondary research you can do sitting at home. But there's a benefit to doing primary research if you have the resources and the time to do it. And how I would approach it is, for example, instead of going to the field with a survey or a script in hand, just go and observe how people in the field behave, what is their, how does their day look like. So instead of going there with a questionnaire and asking them, what is your income, how much do you do, what do you do in a day, just observe what is happening in a setting, in the field setting, and see and try to assess how your design will aid their work, or is it more of a burden to them? How will this help? And how does this design fit within the cultural, the social, and economic context? That's how I would do it. So as an ethnographic researcher, what I used to do when during my field days was we would go to the field early in the morning, start the day with them, follow them around. And so if it's a farmer, I would follow them around and just would not ask many questions, but just pick up casual conversations with the person. So to get a sense of why the person is practicing flash flooding instead of drip irrigation. So I get more insights that way instead of asking them through a survey format. So observing and getting information through conversations is always better than going with a scripted survey. But again, considering the time that you have, you only have few months to do this research. You might not have the resources and the time to do it. So weigh your pros and cons and then consider doing primary research. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Great. Thank you, Liya. And I think Liya probably has lots of expertise on that if you have any questions about doing primary research. But it is something that we struggled with on the challenge in the past, right? Because we always say in our webinars and our resources, know the people that you're designing for, know the problem very intimately, and listen to the people that you hope to help with your design. But it's difficult if you're not able to do that primary research and do that for yourself. So one main thing is definitely look at primary research done by do secondary research. So look at primary research of people that have already done that work for you. Additionally, as Liya was mentioning, resources. So for the first time last year, we had some students use their prototype funding to conduct some primary research. It obviously brings many ethical questions, like Liya was presenting. Consider kind of whether people want you there, and don't kind of overpromise what your appliance might do, or kind of set a tone that your appliance is going to be installed in the community, anything like that. But people have done it in the past. They just need to have the support of their university to do so. So make sure that your university is following kind of research standards and that you're abiding by those, and that your educator is helping you through that process. But it's definitely a possibility now, which I think is kind of exciting. Go ahead, Calvin, you can ask your question.
I just want to ask, in the event that I am improving a concept that's already there, is it allowed to refer, is it to cite the guys who already did it? Then what's the referencing style are we using? Is it any of our choice, or what's that on that? Thank you.
Sorry, Calvin, I missed that. I think I cut out a little bit. Could you just repeat your question?
I'm asking on if I'm improving a concept note that's already there, like done maybe in 2021. So do we cite those guys, or what's the procedure? Then what referencing style do we use, or we just choose of our own, any of our own? Thank you.
We don't have a standard referencing style. I would say even if you don't, I mean, you do have to, but even if you don't necessarily ever have to cite someone, always cite if you've found information somewhere. So that's just good practice. So even if it is a previous submission and they're all under Creative Commons BY 4.0, you should be citing them. So do cite the previous year's submissions and provide a link to that resource of where you found it. That's important for any information you find anywhere. Always cite. In terms of referencing style, we get both in text and footnote citations. So I don't think that's standardized, and no one's gonna kind of mark you down for either one. I personally prefer in-text citations just because it's easier for a reviewer who's looking at reading your document to kind of read it and then see directly where that's coming from and continue, rather than looking at where it is and then jumping down. I find in-text citations better, but I know that's not kind of like industry standard because it can break up. That's more, I think, academic writing. But anyone feel free to correct me on that. Any tips for citing or referencing work, Jakub and Liya?
I think I would say that if you are specifically to the question, if you're specifically saying that you're improving a certain technology or a type of technology that's already been done by a company, then specifically do mention the company and say that this has been done and tested in these areas by this company. And if you're improving, then you have to identify that these are the gaps that you found and you can improve this technology for these reasons. So you definitely have to mention them. And if it's more than one company, then mention all the companies and identify the gap that you're saying. So do acknowledge that this technology already exists and you're trying to improve on that. In terms of referencing style, how do you want to do it? I don't think there's any set standards. Like Sean mentioned, you can either go for footnotes or in text, but make sure that you reference everything that you're doing. So do not, so specifically if you're targeting specific technology that's done and that's been tested, then do specify the company, where it is about, where was it done, and which year maybe, and how long has this been in the market, how successful, and why you're specifically targeting this technology, and why do you think yours will be better than theirs. So yeah, that's all I would want to add.
Great, thank you, Liya. And what are some major challenges or obstacles you have faced in your research, and how have you overcome them? Think back. Yeah.
Wow, that's a big question. I don't know, Jakub, do you have an answer in mind that you can jump into? Then please go ahead.
I mean, there are so many, especially if you're doing research in a new area that hasn't been done before. It's really challenging to actually find the primary data or any information about it. So one example would be some of the more emerging technologies, like we have mentioned before. For example, solar-powered washing machines. There's one that has been developed with support from Efficiency for Access. So and we are now designing research looking into the impacts and the use cases and business models of these washing machines, but there is very little evidence out there at the moment. So what we will have to do is to actually collect primary data and look at a couple of reports that have been published so far, but there's little evidence out there. So that could be one, I guess, answer. The other one is sometimes at the beginning of your project or concept, you have ideas, and then as you progress with it, you can actually get stuck and you actually realize, well, this is not feasible, or this has actually been addressed before and we are just reinventing the wheel. And that's part of the research and of the beauty of research, that kind of unexpected situations come up, and then it's up to you how to overcome them. So there are always solutions, and it really depends on the challenge you're facing. But I would say that's why it's so exciting to be looking into new technologies that haven't been looked into before, or that have challenges that haven't been addressed so far.
Right. And I think that first point, Jakub, is kind of why I wanted to have this webinar, is because, yeah, like Jakub mentioned, if you're working on a solar washing machine, for example, there's there's one in the world that we know of at the moment, solar DC. So it can be difficult to do this research. So it's really helpful, all of those resources that Liya's shared with you, to look into those and see what's there. As Jakub mentioned, we're doing research as well. Both of these two are doing research on key areas that will be helpful to all of you, I think. So yeah, utilize those resources, because it can be difficult if you don't know where to look to find things that are important, that will be important to you in your design. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, I have a question about what sorts of questions should students be asking themselves and trying to answer about the social impact of their projects?
So, so like I mentioned in the slides, I think it would be, is your design inclusive? Have you thought about someone, let's say, if you're thinking about your target audience, have you thought, is this design simple enough for someone who is not technically very averse or doesn't have the technical knowledge? Can that person operate this design? And can it be repaired at home? Does it have to be taken to a different country or somewhere else to be fixed? Um, have you thought about how inclusive it is in terms of gender or disability? Can someone with some disability use this design? Is this going to make this person's life better, improve, or is it like a livelihood opportunity that you're providing to maybe women in the community or people in disabled? So think about how you're trying to make the change in the community with the design. If you're improving the people's life, making it easier, more convenient, is your design user friendly enough and easy enough for people to understand how to use it and how to fix it? I think that's how I would say. Jakub, do you have anything to add?
No, that's yeah, very helpful. And I think, yeah, use that the assessment framework. You have 3 questions under each section. So look at the social impact questions under that. That should help guide you. And I think very critically of them. So show that you have actually considered all of those questions in your design process. So one thing that I often get for social impact and how you're addressing social impact is someone will write essentially one line that says, our design is easy to use, so it is inclusive of everyone. And that will be like everything that is written on that. So really show that you're thinking about all of these criteria and those questions, especially something like social impact, throughout the design process, and are actively putting that into your design, to show that there's kind of a conscious consideration of it. Okay. Well, I think we're coming up on time, and I think people have asked the questions that are coming in. Again, feel free to raise your hand or send in the chat in the meantime. But I'll also put up the surveys. Abdulaziz, you go ahead, and then I'll show you the feedback.
Okay.
surveys and stuff.
Thank you, Sean. Sorry I came in quite late.
No worries.
I would like to ask, how do you deal with the challenges of assembling this component together? Because at times, you start a design and you find out that some of the components needed for this design are quite difficult to acquire or quite challenging to assemble together. And you just, okay, no, let me just give up on this, or let me just switch up, or you get stuck in research. So how do you face the challenges of coupling this component together to have your perfect design? So what is the solution out to this particular problem?
Jakub and Liya, this is something that I think is always difficult for students on the challenge, is that it's a difficult component of research to determine kind of, what are they called? Supply chains for all of your components to your design. How do you find what is available to you within the market, within your country, things that you can acquire? How do you begin kind of market research and supply chain research?
I mean, you mean for the prototype making?
I think often people write in their report something like, I'm going to source my components locally, or I'm going to source my components here. Also for the prototyping, I think for the prototyping, it's a little bit more straightforward. You just look up online all the components that you need, and you find them on Google and buy a single piece from a marketplace or something that you find online. Whereas when you're trying to create a approach scalability within the assessment criteria, it's more about economies of scale and how do you source large area. Yeah, I don't know if you have the answer to this, but see if you can answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's very geography specific. Some countries might have more developed manufacturing sites for a specific appliance type or components than others. So I think it's quite tricky to answer it on kind of a global level. But I would say that usually the companies who are already working in the space have the best understanding of the supply chain. So if your mentor is from the private sector and they have some experience, they should be the ones pointing you in the right direction. Otherwise, I suspect it will be quite difficult to find literature on kind of these specific components because it's a very dynamic world. The supply chain changes frequently, and some appliance distributors or manufacturers might not even publish all the single components where they come from, because that's kind of their unique selling point, how they build these appliances. So yeah, I think that's quite a challenging one, but engaging with the private sector, I would say, is the way to go, unless you already know about resources in your specific country or region, where to find them.
Right. Yeah. Good point, Jakub. I think speak to people is a big one. Speak to people in the private sector. Maybe speak to people in your city, or speak to people building similar technologies, and especially your mentor is a good resource. If you're talking about actual prototyping, Abdulaziz, for your prototype, if you're building that design, do some online shopping, and you'll find plenty of different marketplaces that sell components that will be really useful to you. We do get kind of, it depends on the country, really, that I see in the prototyping applications. You can see people pick up certain ones. If the crowdsolve space for last year is still available online, you can see people's prototyping applications on there and see if they're within your country and see if they're accessing marketplaces that you can utilize. Otherwise, like for example, we had a team in Pakistan last year and they were able to buy all of their components within the city. So they just went to different shops within the city and were able to find them all. So if it's specifically for prototyping, I think that's very helpful because then you don't have to pay for shipping and you can just go pick them up, and they're easily accessible. But it depends where you are. In terms of the actual research, I think Jakub is giving you some good points there. Speak to some people because there won't be necessarily literature on research on that. Calvin asks, is prototyping cheaper than building a final product? So do either of you know that? Is it cheaper to build a prototype than to build kind of a final design? Or what I find, if I do either of you have an answer? No.
I think it depends, but I would say normally, if the prototype is the same size and has the same technical specifications as the final product, it's going to be always more expensive because you need to kind of try different designs. You are buying one piece per component for this one prototype. Whereas if you scaled it up and you had 1,000 of them, then you can secure cheaper prices for each of this component and you make the whole production process much more efficient rather than trial and error. So I would say that, yeah, prototyping will be more expensive unless you make it smaller and
Right.
simpler.
I agree with that. So obviously in the prototyping guidance or something, we say that a prototype doesn't necessarily need to be the final component, the final design. It can be a component of it. It can be kind of a mock-up. It can be made out of cardboard. It can be something for you to visualize. But if you're, yeah, like Jakub says, if you're building the actual design and then you have a budget, I would expect that when you're on the market, that it will be cheaper because of economies of scale, because you'll be able to source components that are more directed at your target audience, or at your target design. I see that Jakub had to leave, and I know we're coming up on time, but we do have one more question in the chat. But let me just run through these final slides for all of you first. So what's coming up? Right now, if you haven't done so already, sign your terms and conditions, create your project space, add all your teammates, and upload your concept note. So those are, we've been talking about this like for weeks. So that's why I ran through those. You'll see it in your weekly roundups. The only way to receive invites to these webinars, to get the weekly roundups, to get all the information you need is by signing the terms and conditions. So make sure your whole team has done that. And then we're coming up on about a month since everyone's had their kickoff workshop. So do get those concept notes in soon. Once a mentor will be tagged to your team's concept note, which is happening at the moment for those who have already submitted them. Oh, sorry, this is your reviewer actually is being tagged. We will be finding mentors for everyone who's submitted a concept note over the next month or so. And they will contact you via email after we tag them in that post. And that's, again, your only way to get your mentor is to submit that concept note. Your concept note is not graded, so do get that in as soon as you can. In terms of midway workshops, next week we have a midway workshop from 10 to 11:30 a.m. on 5 December. That's an opportunity for you all to get together, to reflect on the challenge so far, to meet some other teams, to share some I don't know, findings that you've had so far. EWB UK will be leading that session, and they'll be leading it on Tuesday next week. So look out for that, and the invite should be soon. You'll have already received the registration link in the weekly roundup on Monday. The following week, which I've just confirmed, will be on 11 December, maybe 5 minutes before this call. We'll be joined by Philip Sandwell from GPA, from Unitar. And I believe Liya will be presenting some of our research as well, if she's still on board for that. But Philip Sand will be the main speaker at that session. So that'll be on humanitarian context, designing specifically for humanitarian context, giving you some background, what makes the context unique, as well as some logistical, more specific information. So I think that'll be a really good session, and humanitarian context is a really interesting context to be designing for, and something that we want to encourage people to do this year. The opening of the prototype window 1 for applications is on 12 December. You should have received guidance on how to apply. So do apply to that first window if you can. There will be a second window, but I think the first window, if you want to use it for the actual challenge process, apply to that one. The second drop-in session is on the week commencing 18 December. So I'm just working out what date will work for all of you. And then the final thing I want to raise for everyone is in March, we're going to be having a choose your own webinar. So you will all choose the topic that you're interested in hearing about in a webinar. Then I'll find you the speaker and kind of get that whole session together. So I really want that last one to be guided by your interests to make sure that we're getting everything that you want out of the challenge for you. So we'll be launching a poll in the new year for that and some votes. Getting some suggestions. So please do start thinking about what can be helpful. I'll also be posting a calendar of the full year of events on CrowdSolve. Watch out for that, and you can see then what else will be covered throughout the year and what you think should be additional. Again, here's our feedback survey. Do please fill this out. Rachel, if you have the link, could you drop that in the chat? No worries. If not, we'll share it in the follow-up email. But that is our feedback survey. Please, everyone, do fill that out. Helps us improve these every time. And it's really important for us to get this feedback in these early webinars so that we can improve on future webinars. So just leave that out for 1 second. Sign your T's and C's. I assume that everyone who's attended the webinar today has signed the T's and C's because you've received the invite. But please do that if not. This is maybe the most important step for you at the beginning of the challenge so that you receive updates, you receive key information, and that you can participate on the challenge. It needs to be done before you can do your participation. And here's the newsletter sign up. The next one is coming out December, so look out for that. You can find the October newsletter on CrowdSolve. Yes, there'll be some, I think, good content in this December newsletter, so look out for that. Okay, I'm sorry to keep you, Liya. Feel free to drop out if you need to.
That's fine.
We have one last question, I think. What strategies and approaches can we employ to effectively address and mitigate uncertainty or limitations that may arise in our research findings?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So I don't know if you can address all the limitations that you have in your research, but what you can do is, so let's say you have, you're not finding enough data to substantiate your results, you're not finding evidence, then instead of focusing more on quantitative research or secondary research, you can have short calls or interviews with companies that are engaged in the sector and collect data from them. Get their experiences. How has this market been for them? What challenges did they face? So that's one way to approach it. So instead of trying to address it the way that you would have done, just change your angle a different. The other way is to mention in the research that these are the limitations. This is the scope. Your scope is limited, and this is what I could do with the resources that I have. So that's always good for the reader that you know that what to expect from this research. So you have identified and mentioned that this is what you could find, and these are the limitations of the study. And if you communicate that well in the research, it's fine. I think that should be good enough. But yeah, that the other way is to approach it in a different way instead of focusing on maybe, let's say, completely depending on quantitative data, you can move to qualitative and substantiate your results with more interviews and things like that. I think that's what I would say right now. Don't know, Sean, if you have anything to add.
No, I think that's perfect. Yeah, it's difficult to I don't know, present your research with while capturing that uncertainty. So I think, yeah, cover all your bases, look at it from all angles, consider different perspectives and include those in your research. And as Liya says, I think speaking to people is maybe the best research you can do. They'll have information that you didn't even know that you were meant to look up, that you were meant to find out. So yeah, all of Liya's advice there is, I think, will be really helpful to all of you. And use your mentor. I see that Rachel found the feedback survey. Sorry to send you on the hunt, Rachel, but that's in the chat. So if you haven't filled it out, please do follow that link. I hope that you found this session helpful, especially at this early stage of the process. I'm sorry to keep you late, but thank you for all your questions. And yeah, hopefully you got all the answers you need. If you have any other questions in the follow-up, please just send them over email. I can try to respond to them. And if there's any that I can't respond to, I can always reach out to Liya or Jakub and see if they can respond to those. But thank you all again. I'm going to end the session there. And thank you for coming. See you next week.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you everyone for joining. Bye.
Thanks,
Thanks, Liya.
everyone. Bye.